Okay, today I've got a video that probably only applies to 10 people in the entire world, but if you're one of those 10 people, here's your video. So these are Pro Comp 5-inch lift springs for 2008 to 2010 Ford Super Duties, F250s and F350s. The part number on them is 22518. And there's nothing else on them that tells you what brand they are or anything, so they're kind of chintzy looking. When I was looking on the internet at the pictures, they showed some kind of a overload on the bottom, but as you can see, they don't have that. So I guess it's time to find out if these are actually even 5-inch lift springs or not. So I got a problem with my truck. There's 8-inch blocks on the back springs, and that's just no bueno for towing. I found these for about 250 bucks a piece shipped. So I've got a little under 500 bucks in the pair of these springs all the way to me. You can't beat that deal. Time to get into it. Nice shot of those 8-inch lift blocks that I've got in here. Those suckers are huge. Gives a ton of leverage to the axle on those springs. This might be helpful right here. This does have an overload. That's what that thing is right there. And these supposedly Pro Comp springs, they did something nice here. They left the pin long instead of chopping it off. So I'm thinking I might actually add, I'll take those factory leaf springs apart and add that overload onto these springs. Probably have to clean up these threads a little bit, but that's handy. Now you're gonna need a breaker bar for this. A real breaker bar, preferably. I'm gonna mention the quality control in these quickly. You can see there's plenty of rust underneath the paint there, and the spring pack alignment hasn't been excellent. I already fixed this a little bit, but you can see this hasn't even been clamped tight enough to properly contain the spring pack, and this bushing was sticking away out in the hinterlands. It was like out here, so I'm going to use my my Persuader 9000 to fix that. You know, none of this is actually a big deal. I'm sure they'll still work fine. I mean, come on, I paid less than 250 bucks a piece, so I'm not complaining that much, but you should probably know about that if you're going to look at these. It just kind of paints a picture of nobody really giving a shit. First thing you want to do when pulling out your leaf springs, make sure you got a jack underneath your axle, but also make sure you got the body supported somehow. So first thing you do once you got everything in place, you're going to unbolt your U-bolts. You're going to unbolt this plate first. Make sure you've got a little bit of tension on the rear axle. Not a lot of tension, just a little bit, enough that you're not putting any actual strain on these bolts. And then once you got these bolts undone, you can just drop the axle down and the spring will be completely free. It'll have no more tension on it. And then you can unbolt the ends of it. Yeah, once you're at this stage, you just slowly let the jack lower and let the tension come off the spring. There we go. Now comes the fun part, unbolting the leaf spring from the truck. This is the least enjoyable part of the job. You know, this kind of crap really makes a guy dislike engineers. So, that bolt, as far as I can tell, is a 30mm. It's got a 30mm nut on it. Everything's metric on this truck, so I'm assuming that's right. Well, it was spinning the nut. So I had to get something on the back side, and of course there's not enough room between the fuel tank and that spring perch to get this in there. It just won't fit. So I went and found myself a shallow socket. It's not metric. It is a what is it, 1 3/16 inches. Come on, focus. Fine, don't. It's 1 3/16 inches. But of course the bolt itself is too long. You see that hole in there? Well, the bolt hits inside this socket, so it won't engage the nut. So that's that idea kiboshed. Luckily I had, well, I don't know if it's a lucky, it's still stupid. I have a 30mm deep socket kicking around that I cut down a little bit. I used to use that to do injectors on Chevy 6.5 diesels. And that with a 1/2-inch breaker bar, it's wedged. Like, it is wedged right up against that tank, but you can see I had to sneak it behind the fuel tank strap so that I could engage the frame with it. And now I can get it out, but it's still pretty stiff. I've had better times in a dentist's office, but she's out. All those tools lying there are what it took to get that sucker out. You notice this nut, it's actually a sort of a cage nut, and this is all bent up. This is supposed to just engage the spring mount and let you zap this off without having to put another wrench or ratchet or something on the backside, but that didn't work. Well, now it's time for the top side. That one looks like it's going to be a lot easier. Definitely a lot easier to get at. I'll be able to get a proper wrench onto one side at least. So this one is coming off a heck of a lot easier. The ratchet side there, that's a 24mm, that's the nut, and the head of the bolt's a 21mm. I don't have a 21mm wrench, so I'm just using the old Swedish nut stripper. I don't know if the guy who put this together's girlfriend just broke up with him or what, but what a pain. The other side's exactly the same, so whoever did this meant to do it. And these are the factory springs, so these have never been out. Guess I'm unbolting the shackle. By the way, if you don't have a 24mm wrench, which I don't either, you can use a 15/16. It's the exact same size. Okay, spring's out, and the first thing that I'm noticing is it's quite a bit longer than this lift spring. So they clearly haven't been that careful about their tolerances when they were stretching these out. It's not the end of the world. You just bolt it on the shackle side first, and then bring it over to the front leaf perch, and then hope that your axle's centered after all of that. But the real question, why everybody's here, is this a 5-inch lift spring? And the answer is no. As it sits right now, you'll be lucky to get 4 inches of lift, I think, from that spring to this spring. And this spring is probably the wimpiest spring you're ever going to find in one of these Super Duty trucks. This is F250 that didn't even have any towing gear, which is weird for a diesel. So if you're going to throw these leafs on an F350, I bet you're only getting a couple inches of lift out of it. But like I said, I think I'm going to take that overload off of this spring pack, put it on those springs, and then I should be able to make something work to get the lift that I used to have without a giant block in it. If this is a job that you decide you're going to take on, be prepared for it to go poorly. I've been heating this sucker like you wouldn't believe. Wire brushed it, WD'd it, heated it. I've actually managed to grind a taper on that, the end of that pin with the vice grips. Still no go. So it's going to have to get chiseled off. Sometimes you can get them to turn like this, but not this time. Oh, look at that. That's probably just turning the pin. Okay, the nut's split. I hope this doesn't go springing too hard. Hey, look at that. That's actually turning, it's not spinning the pin. Beauty! Huh? That's a trick my dad taught me when I was a little pup. And now you know it too. Okay, just like that, springs apart. Grabbed every clamp I could to hold this sucker together, and out comes the pin. So now I just throw this overload on the bottom and put it all back together. Alright, that I would say is an honest 5-inch lift spring. Okay, I've got it loosely bolted in on the shackle side. It's not tight. I want to make sure that that can move freely, because as you saw earlier, these springs are shorter than the factory springs. So I need to leave that loose so that the whole spring can move forward. So as you can see, it's got a ways to go. So I'm basically gonna just manhandle that sucker in there. If I haven't mentioned it before, these things are really heavy. Just the way it goes. I'd probably recommend doing this with a buddy. Now, one thing that's abundantly clear here is that the center pin on the leaf springs is nowhere near the center of the axle. Now, normally I would say don't panic, that's fine. Because two things happen when you're doing this. Your axle, as you're dropping it down without the spring on it, it's going to be moving towards the back of the truck. And also when you've got a pack like this that's technically the same length but with a longer arc, you're going to have, until you put weight on it, that arc is going to be closer to the front, because ideally you want the same end distance from the front leaf perch to the center pin. Unfortunately, on these leaf springs, we don't have that. These leaf springs are a good 1.5 inches too short from the perch to that pin. So I'm not sure yet what I'm going to do about that. I may end up having to build some custom blocks to make that work out. Otherwise, these wheels are going to be really far forward in the wheel wells. That is some piss poor quality control. Well, I've got this rigged up with come along, and I've already got it closer to the front than it should be, and it's still about 1.5 inches, 1.25 inches away from hooking onto that pin. So I guess I have to fabricate some blocks. Actually, I have some 3-inch blocks kicking around. I might just cut them up and use them. I also got this thing off of all of its jacks. Everything is let down. It's actually sitting on the springs. The truck is bearing its full weight on the springs right now. That's necessary to get your measurements accurate. That's how I know I still need to go back quite a bit. I also checked the height. I measured off the axle to the frame on each side, and it's right now it's sitting on about 2.25 inches from the axle perch to the spring. So it's dead on right now, pretty much to where it was before. So 2.25 inches plus the 1 inch for the overload, 3.25, let's even call it 3.5 inches. That's I guess it's probably an honest 4.5-inch lift spring. It's not too far off 5 inches at all. But of course, that's on those wimpy F250 springs. Again, if you have an F350, these will not be 5-inch lift springs. There's just no way. But if you got an F250 with some lower end springs in the back like I had, you're going to get pretty close to 5 inches out of these. Actually, I changed my mind. I'm not going to cut up those 3-inch. I'm going to cut up the 8-inch blocks. There's a 0% chance I'll ever use those again. And I actually already hacked those up anyways because they didn't give me the proper drive shaft angle on this thing. So that's what I'm going to do. This is what I came up with. I've got the pin offset 1.25 inches. and the height of the block is 2 3/8. So all things considered, should work out good. That turned out pretty good. The center of the axle is pretty much directly underneath that bump stop above it, and that's exactly where it's supposed to be. So I think I nailed it. Now I've got a new problem. This plate here that the U-bolts clamp onto is supposed to sit dead center on the pin, but it can't now. It has to be centered on the axle, and that's going to put it right around here. So I guess I'm going to cut this pin off and go from there. Well, I appear to have gotten lucky for once on this job. I cut the pin off, and it looks like the nut just perfectly slides into here. With this sitting right up against the nut, basically, you can see that it is pretty much perfectly in line with that pin. Ideally, this plate should be centered on the pin because that actually helps locate this. But the nuts that are on these pins are actually bigger than the factory nuts, so even if that was an option, I'd have to drill that hole out bigger, which wouldn't be a big issue, but it is the way it is. I'm just going to make sure that those U-bolts are extra tight. Well, that's the job done. I've actually left all these bolts a little bit loose, because I want both sides done and a little bit of weight in the truck before I tighten everything up. So in the meantime, I have a whole other side to do. I get to do that all over again. I don't think I'm going to bother filming that. So these leaf springs, they're cheap. You're going to have to put a bunch of time into them to make them work, but they are cheap. To get a set of leaf springs built to do all of this, I'm not joking, it would have cost me $1,200. I priced it out. So I'm still under $500 into this, even though I've had to do a lot of extra farting around. I guess it depends who you are. If doing the extra work is fine by you, these are a screaming deal. And if you want something that's just going to bolt right in and be the way it should be, you're probably going to need to spend more money. So there you go. Hope this helps.